Greetings, Hades and gentlemen, and welcome to the first volume of Tales from the Witch House. I am your host, Dr. Gallow, and what a terrifying treat I have in store for you. Here you will find, collected for the first time, 3 original short horror stories in an anthology inspired by classics such as Creepshow, Tales from the Crypt, and even the Twilight Zone. Please take a moment to subscribe for even more scary tales. Now, let us begin, for the things that go bump in the night grow impatient for your attention. Up first, Lockdown. A new spin on an old legend, in a topical tale reflecting on the horrors many have endured in recent times, and asks, what if they don't even know the half of it?
I understand why this year has been so difficult for so many. What with the lockdown and the self-quarantining and the social distancing. I have to be honest though, for me, it's been an absolute joy. I haven't really got any friends or family to speak of anyway, so I'm not missing anyone. I learned to enjoy the pleasure of my own company a long time ago. I rarely shop, so I haven't had to wait in any annoying queues at the supermarket. All in all, it's been pretty easy for me. When I've been hungry, I've just nipped out. Yesterday I decided to have lunch in the park. I met this very attractive young man while I was there. He was sitting under a tree, reading a book by himself. No pets, no kids, no girlfriend or boyfriend that I could see. He looked up at me, a little fearfully, as I got closer. Understandable. Everyone's wary of each other getting too close at the moment, aren't they? And these masks we're all wearing add to the tension somewhat. I mean, you never know who's walking up to you, do you? Could be a mugger, or anything. There was no one else around. When I was close enough, I whipped off the mask and managed to get my hand over his mouth before he could scream. Everyone screams when they see my face. We don't have those dainty little retractable fangs you see in the films. I look like a shark. There's nothing romantic about how I feed. My lunch is horrified, obviously, but I finish up fast. My jaw widens, and the maw wraps around the massive gash I've just torn out of his throat to catch all that lovely red stuff. I snatch the occasional glimpse into his life as his essence flows into me. He did have a boyfriend, as it turns out. He had poached eggs for breakfast. He was worried about his mum. The lockdown has made all this so much easier. That's another thing the films get wrong. It's not that we can't go out during the day, but with mouths like these, you'd have us strung up in no time. It was you that made us nocturnal. The masks mean I can do pretty much whatever I want, and nobody gives me a second glance anymore. I leave him, drained and propped up against the tree, and make my way home before anyone notices. Next month, I'll go to the other side of the city to eat. It's a big place we live in. Perfect for the likes of me to get close to the likes of you.
Well, I don't know about you, but after that, I could use a drink. Perhaps a glass of red. Now, have you ever found yourself out in the woods and been overcome by the eerie feeling that something out there was watching? Tracks is the story of one man's search for solitude and what he encounters along the way, and features the vocal talents of my friend and fellow frightener, Evan D. Shelton, the creative powerhouse behind the lurking transmission. Prepare to be chilled.
I've been going to the cabin since I was a kid. My dad used to take me often, just as his father had taken him, to learn about the great outdoors and to fish and whatnot. Nobody was really sure who owned the place. If it had belonged to someone outside our kin, they had certainly never made it known, and us Crandalls had been staying up there for so many years, nobody could remember a time when it hadn't been in the family. It was a simple affair. A door, 4 windows with curtains, and an old stone fireplace. The cabin itself was made of wood, pine, and its unmistakable smell hadn't dwindled even a little over the years. It was just toward the end of winter 2 years ago when I last visited the place. The landscape still a beautiful painting, rendered in snow, silver, and green. Before that, I don't recall how long it had been exactly, but I reckon it must have been coming up on 5 years or so. I had only planned to stay for a couple of nights. It was the perfect place to get away from things, and life had been a little hectic for what felt like a long time. I needed the space, the solitude, to clear my head. I'd made the drive easily, even in the snow. There was hardly anyone else on the road. The cabin isn't exactly close to any place anyone would be heading to. I don't think I saw another car at all for the last hour or so of the journey. I'd switched off my phone and dug out a well-thumbed book, and that was how I'd spent the day, enjoying every second of my own company. Eventually it was time for bed. The fire was burning low. The chicken legs I'd cooked on it had been eaten, and almost half of the modestly priced bottle of whiskey that was warming me up from the inside had been drunk. With a rubber hot water bottle under my blanket, I fell contentedly to sleep. I remember waking up to the sound of the forest animals outside the cabin, crunching in the snow. I figured there had to have been 2 or 3 of them out there, running around and playing together. The footfalls were too heavy to be rabbits, but too soft to have been bears, so I figured they could have only been deer. It wasn't too long before I drifted happily off to sleep again. I knew it was morning when I heard the birds, although it still wasn't quite daylight out. I got up and raked the fire, which had all but died. It was still warm in the cabin, but I knew that would pass quick, so I pulled my coat on and walked out the door toward the car to get some dry firewood from the trunk. I looked down and saw something in the morning half-light that stopped me dead. There, in the snow, were the tracks of whatever had been running around the cabin all night. It was handprints. Dozens and dozens of handprints. Christ alone knows how I made it back down in the car in the half-light and half-drunk, skidding on the slush all over the roads, but I did, without a backwards glance. I was terrified of what I might see behind me. I got no idea what sort of condition the cabin would be in now. I left the door open, and I'm sure as hell not going back to close it. If someone finds the other half of my bottle, they can have it. They're gonna need it. I'm not sure where this story ends, really. I haven't been back to the cabin these past years, but it snowed here yesterday, and I was reminded, horribly, of that last morning at the cabin. Today, when I went outside to get my newspaper, the only track in the fresh snow on the path outside was a pair of handprints, just outside my front door.
How horrifying, having to leave a good bottle of scotch in the middle of nowhere like that. Our final tale in this volume covers a subject familiar to many. I'm sure more than a few viewers have had to suffer because of a neighbour from hell. Special guest star Lady Spookaria breathed life into this little shocker, simply entitled The Neighbour.
I only saw the old man who moved into the apartment next door once, and that was on the morning he arrived. He was polite enough, wishing me a cheerful good day, and he looked smart in a shirt and bow tie combination that only a gentleman of a certain age can really pull off. His hair was thin and white but not unkempt, combed neatly over in a side parting. And then he was inside. The door was closed, and I didn't see him again. I certainly heard him, though. I mean, everyone's noisy sometimes, aren't they? You expect it in a place like this. The walls between these apartments are hardly thick, and I heard the young couple who lived on the other side before him, occasionally. But they were as quiet as a mouse in comparison. He made an awful lot of noise for an old fella. He was always shouting. I presumed he was shouting at someone on his phone, that he was a little hard of hearing, perhaps. Maybe he was just shouting to himself. There were loud thumps sometimes, and I often became concerned that he might have fallen, but then the shouting would resume, and I figured he must have been alright. I had no idea what the hell he was up to, but I was able to sleep through it, and I decided it was really none of my business. I resolved to ignore the noise as best I could and keep one ear on it, in case I needed to call someone. A couple of weeks in, I ended up knocking on his door anyway. In part, I wanted to make sure he was doing okay, but I was mainly there because I wanted to see if my showing up in person might be what nudged him to keeping the noise to a respectable level. It had, gradually, gotten substantially louder, to the point he was starting to wake me up in the middle of the night. When I knocked on the door, the shouting stopped, so I knew he'd heard me. He didn't answer though. I knocked again, but after a few minutes it became apparent that he wasn't going to speak to me. So I went back, and as soon as I shut my apartment door, the shouting started again. The noise continued to get worse over the coming weeks. The thumps escalated to occasional crashes. The shouting got louder and more intense. I couldn't quite make out his words, but he was obviously very angry about something and it was frightening to hear. Even more so when, one night, he started banging on my wall. Now, I'm not a noisy person. I know this, and I scarcely even have time to watch movies. When I still lived at home, my parents often thought I'd gone out because of how quiet I sat up in my room by myself, drawing or reading or whatever. There was really no reason for him to be banging on my wall, and that just made the whole thing even more scary. He was clearly irrational, and it crossed my mind that he might be having some sort of breakdown. I was worried about him, but I was more worried about the danger I might have been in. I was reluctant to call the cops though, until at least I was sure I really had to. Nobody likes a snitch. I hung on a little longer. In a couple of short days it all became unbearable. He was practically screaming now, yelling awful, vulgar words in a furious rage at the top of his voice. The banging on the wall got louder and more violent, to the point I was sure he was throwing things at it. The impact made my pictures rattle and fall down. Last night, among the dreadful roars and the demolition job he was doing on his apartment, he screamed my name. I heard the words, clear as a bell, and went cold. The idea of all that rage being directed at me was simply terrifying. I didn't even want to think about how he knew my middle name. I hadn't used it for years. Then and there, I called the cops. I almost didn't hear them arrive. I'd put my headphones on shortly after I made the call, so I didn't have to listen to the awful sounds coming from the other apartment while I sat there waiting for help. It was by pure chance that they knocked on the door during a gap between songs. There were two officers, a young man and an older one. Both had moustaches, I noticed. The younger one did all the talking. He asked to double-check a few details first, so I told him when the noise started, what sort of sounds I'd heard, how well I knew the tenant, and, lastly, that I had, very clearly, heard him shout my name. I gave dates and times. I kept a log. He was very pleasant, thanking me for the call and reassuring me that it was nothing to worry about. But he kept repeating himself, a little incredulously. Are you sure the noise came from that side? For 4 weeks? And he definitely called your name? I pressed him to find out why they didn't seem to believe me, and he shrugged as he told me, finally, that they just couldn't fathom where the noise would have been coming from. They had already gained entry to the apartment, you see, and found the old guy on the floor in the kitchen. He'd probably been lying there for about a month, likely since the day he'd moved in. He was dead. The younger cop kept talking, but I was only half listening. I think he said the old man had taken a tumble and cracked his head on the way down. That there hadn't been anyone else inside. He said something about the smell. The officers went out into the corridor to do whatever it was they needed to do, and I just stood there with the door open, staring at nothing. My God, could I smell him now? I knew I had to get out of there, so I started packing as fast as I could. I wasn't sure where I was going, but decided to worry about that later, rather than spend another night in that place. The authorities busied around for a short while, and eventually some more people came to take the body away. Eventually, they locked up the door behind them and left the old man's apartment empty. As I heard the ambulance pull away, the banging started again.
He'd obviously fallen for her. That concludes this volume of terrifying tales, but there are more in store for those of you who enjoy the occasional fright of fancy. If you're not subscribed, now would be a good time. My powers reach far and wide, and I will be checking. Be safe, be well, behave, but not too much.